protocols observed, Your Excellencies. Thank you very much. We've just had a great conversation on the African economic outlook presented by my colleagues, the economists at the African Development Bank. And now it's time to take the conversation from the economic analysis to the private sector discussion and analysis to see what it is we can do. So I would like to welcome you to our knowledge event focused on innovative financing instruments to crowd in private climate investments in Africa. We have a fantastic conversation starter and a fantastic panel to stimulate a conversation on this topic. I would like to first make some introductory remarks, then we'll play a short video after the panelists come on stage, and then afterwards I'll invite the conversation starter to really kick us off. Then I'll have an interactive session with the panelists, after which we would open it up to also hear from some of the audience, people in the audience, in terms of questions you may have for the panelists, but also contributions you may want to make from your own vantage perspective. So the African economic outlook has been embargoed. So I was copiously writing notes as my colleague Vice President Kevin Urama was making his presentation. And I just want to touch on a few of the highlights that I think is very pertinent to the conversation that we're going to have today. So, based on the nationally determined contributions of African countries, it is estimated that the annual amount of climate finance needed in Africa is $240 billion. However, today, Africa only realizes $30 billion per annum, whether it's from the public sector or the private sector. Hence, the gap is really a whopping $210 billion per annum. But if you look at it further, given the conversation we're going to have today on private sector financing of climate and green growth, only 14% of that $30 billion is actually delivered by the private sector. So that's really about $4 billion, exactly 4.2, but let's just say $4 billion. So that is the starting point for us in Africa. $4 billion of private sector financing going into climate finance and green growth. Then given the limited fiscal space in most African countries from addressing what we've heard described as the 3 C's, which are COVID, conflict, and climate finance, there's clearly a limit on what public finance can do. However, public finance can leverage private sector, and so improving public finance can also lead to better leverage of private sector. So we hope this will be teased out in the discussion we have. So we're going to explore how we can attract private climate finance with scale and speed to address the devastating impacts of climate change in Africa. Another point that resonated with me is 9 out of the 10 most vulnerable countries globally to the adverse impacts of climate change are in Africa. And these are mostly fragile or transition markets. And one of the things I heard Kevin say is that climate finance seems to be inversely proportional to the countries that are most vulnerable in terms of climate change. Our biggest challenge in Africa is with adaptation. And it's the reason that the African Development Bank partnered with the Global Center of Adaptation to establish the African Adaptation Acceleration Program, or AAAP, to focus on providing adaptation solutions. So as we think of how to apply innovative financing instruments to the climate change challenge in Africa, we really have to think 54 countries in different segmentations. We can not only look at private solutions that work in the middle-income countries and assume that's enough. We have to look at really what works in the most vulnerable countries So yes, we're not necessarily going to look at it really in terms of 54 countries, but we need to probably look at it in terms of segmentations of countries, especially in relation to their resource base and how well they would attract private finance. This is also one of the reasons that the African Development Fund has agreed to create a climate action window, which targets to raise about $13 billion over a long period of time, and was started last year with $430 million contributed in what we call the ADF 16 replenishment. So those are really the introductory remarks that I want to make, but let me now invite the distinguished panel to please come on board. First, Her Excellency Dr. Rania Al-Mashat, the Minister for International Cooperation in Egypt. I encourage all of you to come on board right away, but I'll mention your names as you're coming on board. Dr. Babel Kofler, the Parliamentary State Secretary and Governor for Germany. And of course, Dr. Kofler, happy birthday. I'm not as good as my boss, Dr. Adeshina, so I will not try to sing, but happy birthday. Okay, that's as far as I go. Then I'd like to introduce Ms. Bjørk Sankia, the Deputy Minister and Governor for Norway. And if I pronounce the name badly, you would help me. Okay. I'd like to also introduce Ms. Emmy Okairi, the Temporary Alternate Governor for Finland. Next, Dr. Sidi Kulta, the Director General, Arab Bank for Economic Development in Africa, also known as BADEA. And then Mr. Konstantin Libitovsky, the Vice President for Investment Operations in Region 2, Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank. So, Program Director, if you could please show the video.
Happy birthday.
Thank you very much.
If we can go to the video now.
Africa is endowed with abundant natural resources and diverse ecosystems that critically support services, development, and livelihoods across the continent. Yet the amount of climate finance inflows to Africa has consistently fallen short of what African countries need for their climate action. If African countries want to respond comprehensively to the growing challenges of climate change and achieve their green growth ambitions, they must scale up climate investment by exploiting all potential funding sources, especially from the private sector. Africa is lagging globally on private climate finance investments, with only 14% coming from private actors. The consequence of these highly selective private investments is that many critical and highly vulnerable sectors to climate change, such as agriculture and also less developed markets with tight fiscal spaces, are left aside by private sector. We must develop innovative financing instruments that work in Africa to mobilize at scale investment in climate solutions, thus achieving sustainable development. We need to go beyond traditional financing approaches by developing out-of-the-box solutions tailored to countries' structural characteristics, leveraging their comparative advantage. This is the Thematic Knowledge Event, Innovative Financing Instruments to crowd in private climate investments in Africa. The revolution starts now.
Conversation starter, Dr. Christopher Marks, who is the Managing Director, Head of Portfolio Solutions, Innovative Finance and Growth Markets with the Mitsubishi UFJ Financial Group. Christopher has worked in financial markets and also the financial sector advisory across both the public and private sector for over 20 years. This is one of the reasons we feel that he's best placed to be our conversation starter, because he's seen it from really both sides. He happens to be an African Development Bank alum as well, where he was a senior advisor to the private sector group. And of course, he has also worked at the Mitsubishi financial group. I've asked Christopher to hone in on the challenging and particular factors that we should discuss and think through to constructively engage in this sphere of innovative financing instruments to crowd in private sector investments in Africa with scale and speed. So Christopher, welcome. Now, as you come on board, it looks like we're exchanging roles. 2 weeks ago, moderator, and I was on the panel. Now we're reversed. Over to you, Christopher.
Vice President, thank you very much. And I take on, as the Vice President say, this welcome challenge of speaking both as a private sector investment banker, but equally as a proud alum of the African Development Bank. So I have worked on both sides of the fence. I will set forward as well, I hope, a constructive but also challenging tone, which was the instructions given to me. And I do it in the following context. The urgency and the complications of the climate emergency demand a rethinking both of the scale and the content of the manner in which we talk about the private sector and the mobilization of the private sector. It is my contention that multilateral development banks still have in their mind the frame that was originally developed in 2015, all the way back to the World Bank's Billions to Trillions document. That the essential solution for the driving forward of the mobilization of the private sector runs through multilateral development bank balance sheets. So it's very clear in that document. I would argue a lot of that same logic still remains. The multilateral development banks are generally composed, well-intentioned as they are, of project finance colleagues. They think in infrastructure terms. They think in terms of commercial banks like MUFG, big project finance houses they've worked with for a long time. They think in terms of the private sector development bank arms. I would argue, and I will talk about this, that is not who we are targeting for the numbers, to address the numbers that have been talked about throughout this day. Number two, as part of the same logic, I would argue that as we talk about the pipeline gap, it's the perpetual topic at these conversations. The multilateral development banks, and I think partners as well, we tend to think in terms of last-minute technical assistance or getting the policies right. It's a phrase that is often used in development materials. And I think there's also an interesting comment, and I will reference the comments by President Adesina. There's a sense that if the instruments are prepared, the private sector will come. It's a question of tools. And I would say even particularly in the context of climate, and I was here at the COP27 in this building, there was a high level of consternation with the sense that the private sector is not pulling its weight, it's not stepping up to the challenge, and it should be evident that there are opportunities for the private sector. It doesn't work this way. And I would suggest, as I talk about 3 points, number one, we have to turn the perspective on its head. Number one, we have to get onto this continent the same institutional investors that work in Mexico, that work in India, that work in Indonesia at large size. These are insurance companies, pension funds, or sovereign wealth funds. They do not work on the continent yet. Number two, and this is about the question of instruments and why the private sector may or may not come in size. We have to understand there is no natural mandate for these large institutional investors to come onto the continent or to work in climate finance specifically on the continent. You have to understand what is the risk-reward equation that they manage, which has been given to them by their shareholders. You have to understand, particularly as we talk about PPPs, an environment of constrained public balance sheets, what is the interaction between country risk and project risk that is inherent in the very contractually heavy PPP structures. Do investors understand how a solar PV farm works in Africa if they have never done such an experiment before? Governments have to be appreciative as well that their commitments are clear, so that when we use multilateral risk mitigation products which attach to government obligations most effectively, are those obligations clear? We are sitting in the presence of Minister Al-Mashad. I will reference, moreover, a transaction which we executed a year ago, working with the government of Egypt to refinance 6 solar fields in the Benban solar field. That was 19-year financing. It was a green project bond. We had in that transaction investors that have never ever set foot in Africa, coming all the way from Korea, let alone working in Egypt, because the government was brave enough to renegotiate the PPA. These are politically very sensitive documents. Equally, their commitments were extremely clear about what happens in the event of default or complications on the project. Therefore, the multilateral guarantee products that we applied were extremely effective. Number 2, in terms of climate finance, we have to think not as implementers of blended finance, but you have to think the way the UN agencies talk about, you have to think like philanthropies, and you have to think the way the specialized climate NGOs think. They understand the subtleties, the interplay, and the causality between climate change and the design, the siting, and the programming of infrastructure. Even if you have done a water project or a waste management project or even an electric vehicle charging station, if it is not properly sited according to adaptation thinking, then you are missing a fundamental element. The adaptation question, natural capital, has been mentioned on this stage for the past couple of days. I'm not sure, for example, as we think about some of the tools governments use, that they are integrated into the way projects are designed. NDCs, national adaptation plans, government ownership, that is the starting point for any serious conversation about where you site and plan for investments in the climate frame. That is where the value chain linkages will come and eventually where the investment pipeline will come from. I've heard the reference to the African Development Bank partnering with the Global Center for Adaptation, and you didn't mention, Vice President, the Rockefeller Foundation is also a partner. It's very interesting, very progressive thinkers. Finally, and this is really, I speak to colleagues that are on the board of the African Development Bank who are sitting on this panel, I think in an environment of scarcity in which the principle of minimum concessionality has to apply, we're very comfortable talking about social impact, about environmental impact, how we measure those elements, how the board papers pay close attention to ensure that every penny achieves maximum impact across those metrics. We don't talk at all about the positive externalities or the additionality associated with financing. What is the nature of the financing? Financing instruments can also have positive externalities. They can have market learning benefits, you can have innovation benefits, and most importantly for this continent, you can have the ability of investors over time to reduce the economic and reputation risk that they perceive through their incorporation in the facilities. So for example, and I will close here, if you have a situation which is very common on this continent, where you have financing packages composed 100% of multilaterals and DFIs in known technologies like solar PV, in either an ADF blend or an African Development Bank country, relatively high capacity jurisdiction, I would suggest to you that financial additionality is 0 or negative. We cannot afford to spend money without pure innovation equally on the financial additionality side. Vice President, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christopher. Let's give Christopher a hand. So Christopher has, contributed with some thought-provoking points. I'll give you a sense of really what I heard, but then I will actually try to incorporate that into really the questions I pose to you. So he's suggesting that the MDBs and the DFIs have a rethink of the tools and approaches they take towards climate finance. and that was one clear thing I heard. He wants us also to include the new types of mainstream infrastructure investors, different from those who are attracted to the traditional project finance. So he talked about the pension funds, the global institutional investors, and I would even add the African institutional investors as well as the strategic investment funds that we see in a few of our countries. And then lastly, in an environment of scarcity of concessional capital, or essentially public sector capital that can be leveraged, we need to better understand financial additionality. I hope you concur with at least some of the thoughts that provokes, but let me translate this into a few questions. Your Excellency, Rani Al-Mashat, you're a host, and also Egypt has actually done a lot in this space already. So I'd like to start off to learn really about how things have gone at home, okay? I mean, so what are the examples of good practices at the country level in Egypt, tapping into private sector financing for climate and green growth? And what are some of the key success factors in your experience and views?
Well, thank you very much, and again, a warm welcome to everyone here in Sharm el-Sheikh. This is the second panel that I'm participating in that we look at innovative finance and blended finance and how to draw in the private sector. And Solomon, you mentioned 3 C's. I will mention another 3 C's, commitment, clarity, and credibility. So we need to have country commitment on what it is it wants to do, in part moving towards achieving its climate action and climate goals, which again, we all know that individually, by achieving our climate goals, the global goals are going to be met. So this is number one, commitment from the countryside, and I will link that to what was mentioned about country ownership, because without country ownership, you will always feel that climate action is a burden, whereas we want to make sure that climate action is intertwined with development and that they can echo one another, so that the social impact, the private sector engagement impact, the skilling impact, all of this is seen as an integrated framework rather than contention or exclusion between them. Climate and development should be seen as mutually, they are not mutually exclusive, they come hand in hand. The second is, and this is, we did a study with African Development Bank and many multilateral development banks in the private sector and philanthropists and non-government actors, non-state actors during the run-up to COP, which is the Sharm el-Sheikh Guidebook for Just Financing. And there what is extremely important, each stakeholder has a role to play to make sure that we are able to mobilize climate finance and we are able to engage private sector. All of us know that the gaps for financing, I don't want to go through more statistics, but the gaps for financing are big for the SDGs, are big for climate, and even worse now with the global backdrop, which is very tough and has increased the risk perception and the risk ratings or the risks of investment in countries. So these are all facts. So what we need, and this is also what the study shows, or the excuse, is that the 100 billion or whatever has been pledged doesn't make it to countries because they don't have investable projects. And here comes the idea of clarity. You have to be very clear with the projects that you want to implement, the projects that are part of your commitment to your climate action and hence the global action, and that's where country ownership comes in. And here, whether it's the NDCs, in our case, we have a 2050 climate strategy, which identifies sectors that Egypt is going to be investing and wants to invest in between now and 2050. These plans are translated into projects, and this is how we, together with our international partners, put the Egypt's country platform for the nexus of water, food, and energy, the NWFI program, NWFE, and NWFI in Arabic means fulfilling pledges. And the idea here is, okay, we have mitigation, adaptation, equally important for us. We cannot be a JETP country because we are not using coal, but we want to leverage on the partnership with everyone here, all my colleagues from Germany, from Finland, from Norway, from the AIIB, from Badia, from African Development Bank. All of this goodwill and commitments that countries, whether bilateral or bilateral into the multilateral system, can come together and say, here's a country that has commitment, has clarity on projects, so let's work together to see how we can implement them. And then the final point is credibility. Countries such as Egypt, we've been working since 2014, be it BinBan, be it the wastewater, water waste management plans. It was mentioned yesterday in the opening, the Gabal al-Asfar, the Abu Rawash, we have Bahr al-Baqar, we have so many projects that we have done with the international community that have been implemented and have shown results. And here comes the credibility. We have the credibility. So when we put together a platform and say we're serious about these projects, the international community comes with the country in order to be able to use the concessional finance available to crowd in the private sector. So these are my opening remarks: commitment, clarity, and credibility to be able to put into action the country-owned projects to avail concessional finance to crowd in the private sector. Each stakeholder has a role: the government, the regulatory authorities, the financial sector, the MDBs. In our platform, Nuwafi, we have concessional, we have technical assistance, we have a debt swap with Germany, which we're very proud of, and this is going to be an example as we move from COP27 to COP28 to show that there has been a debt swap in the energy pillar of Nuwafi that says today when there is debt distress in the world, when everybody's talking about debt for nature, we are showing an example of debt in the energy pillar. So this is also going to be extremely novel within this country platform.
Okay, no, thank you very much, Your Excellency. And I'm going to quote you on the new 3 C's:
Yes.
Commitment, clarity, and credibility. But clearly, this integrated approach has been a journey. It doesn't happen overnight. Yeah. Now we're talking about scale and speed going forward. First of all, I'd like to travel with you to several African countries to share your experience, create maybe different ways of knowledge sharing, because this is important. It's important for people to understand it's not a checklist approach, okay, countries to understand. But how do we marry what was a journey with now this whole pressure to act with speed and scale?
There's a fact that all countries face today, as well as private sector, as well as NGOs. If your project does not address climate action somehow, finance is going to be very difficult. Okay. And this is a fact. Even in the way MDBs today are looking at their evolutions and roadmaps going forward, everyone is thinking, how can we mobilize our resources to be able to meet or face climate challenges. And therefore, you mentioned very correctly, there's a lot of need for knowledge sharing, experience sharing, and so South-South cooperation becomes extremely important, and triangular cooperation. This is something that Egypt is very keen on doing. We just had a side event on South-South cooperation, and we want to do this with our partners. BinBan was mentioned. BinBan is our flagship project with the international community, concessional finance for private sector engagement, but it started with structural reforms that the government did for the feed-in tariff. So as you mentioned, it's a journey. You go from thinking that you can control everything, letting go, allowing the private sector. On sustainable transport, today for the first time, Egypt is allowing is deregulating its transportation sector. We have dry ports led by a private consortium. When we talk about water desalination, and the African Development Bank is with us in the water pillar of Nuwafi as a lead partner. So again, it's inviting the private sector in water desalination. So yes, we started since 2014, and it's a very good we can show other countries, and we can show what we've done with all of you, because it's a partnership. We believe in international partnerships. We believe in the global partnerships for effective development cooperation, OECD principles, country partnership, country ownership, inclusive partnerships, we monitor our results, and there's accountability and transparency. So those 4 principles are real, and this is how we move, we've moved, and we want to move forward on Noafi and on other projects as well.
Okay, no, thank you very much, Your Excellency. I'll come back on partnerships, but let's probably shift gears now and really learn from the experience away from home. And so I want to go to Governor Kofler. Happy birthday again. Okay. In Germany's experience, how can African countries take advantage of existing sources and innovative instruments for private sector finance and for climate and green growth in Africa? And, you know, as a follow-up, what is BMZ doing to support Africa in this regard?
Well, thank you. Thank you first for celebrating my birthday a little bit with me. Thanks to all of you. It's one thing I have to say before, we are quite convinced that not one size fits all approach should be undertaken, because what we experience in Germany or in Europe, that might be different from circumstances in other countries and other continents. So I'm always quite careful with giving advices. We have to look carefully at each and any situation in any country. I think that's a first thing which is important for us. What we are doing in Germany is we are on a long-term journey, and what I think what is also practical for all the other countries is what I heard a little bit from my colleague here. The 3 C's I like very much. The one thing is the commitment, and it was a commitment we undertook a long time ago in Germany to really go on a decarbonization track. So what we see also in our partnerships and in our discussion with partner countries around the globe is we need a long-term commitment first. That is something any country has to develop on its own, how that could look like, what are the national ideas on that. So, but we need that commitment. And I want to say those commitments are also necessary because we have to have a dialogue in our societies. That's something we experienced in our country. You have to have a understanding in a whole society that there is a transformation necessity for transformation. So you have to have a look on the social impact of all your measures, and that's why we are so much discussing things like just transition. So that is something to create an environment. Also for the private sector, which is then at the end of the day stable enough to really foster that investment. Because it doesn't help if every 2 years maybe there's another approach then, and that's also not really helpful for strategic and long-term investment. The clarity is something I really come up to your 3 C's because I think they are quite important. The clarity is also important. What we did is coming up with law-making processes, have a goal in our own country, when do we want to be fossil or coal-free, for example. So we have a strategy to end coal in Germany, to use coal in 2038, at least. So if it's earlier, that's fine. Nobody's against that. But at least it had to be in 2038. So that means that's also important framework for private sector to see how it will be also financially positive to invest in new technologies, because they have the space then for their innovations and for innovative technologies. You need a space to create a space and to really allow them to come into the market. So what we also did was having, for example, feed-in tariffs for renewable energy, so that they really have access then to the market and have a fair chance on the market. If you don't create a framework like that, and that has to do a lot with lawmaking and the system surrounding it, it's not so easy, I think, for a private sector to come into, because what should they rely on certain topics? And the credibility is something, I think, which for us is important also in an international context. I know we had discussions the last year. I don't want to repeat that for sake of time, but of course, if there are questions, I'm here to answer them. But we have to be credible with what we are doing. So we really want to stick to our goals. We created a carbon market, for example, in Germany, to come up with pricing the use of carbon dioxide, and be clear also, that's actually quite a discussion in the population, because if you price something, sometimes prices are going up also for everybody. Yeah. So that's a political discussion you have to face, and you have to see how maybe social injustice has to be balanced in that. So that's something important. And then we are coming up from our own learnings with ideas how we can partner. And that I think is an important thing, is the nexus on water, food, energy. But we also launched last year in the COP here in Sharm el-Sheikh a new platform on hydrogen, green hydrogen. So to come up with really reliable partnerships which are financed and which are from the framework set, that all partners have some positive effect from that. So this platform, for example, Power to X we call it, we launched is with for us, quite amount of public money finance. It's about 270 million euros. And we count, or we calculate with a leverage by 4, so we are about a billion, I think is the English term. Yeah, I'm always counting with millions, billions. A billion of money then, which could be invested in green hydrogen, and it's about technical assistance, but it's also about opening markets and having access then to the hydrogen energy market around the value chains. So it's something I think which also could be counted under credibility, to come up with offers like that to show that we are really partnering.
No, thank you very much, Governor Kofla. Let me just follow up on one area that I really liked. It's really about creating markets, you said, which means there's a business opportunity.
Yeah.
It's not just for the public good aspect. And you also talked about essentially the global supply chain in which Africa can participate, you know, in terms of creating markets, whether it's green hydrogen, etc. Can you expand on that a little more? Because, you know, a lot of times people think that when we're talking about, you know, climate change, we're only looking at the public good aspect. But you've essentially said we can look at, you know, new business opportunities. Yeah.
I think it's always both. Of course, it's a public good we are defending, and of course it's necessary to undertake any action to defend this public good. But we have to use all possibilities and all measures we can undertake to really defend that public good. And therefore we have the public sector, which we've seen also in the African economic outlook, plays an important role then to trigger and to foster private investment, so that has to work together. And of course it is a business opportunity. So what we experienced and hope to see also in other countries and continents is that investing in renewable energy, for example, is a real job creator, and a creator for decent jobs, and jobs which are for a long term then there for the young generation, for example, on the African continent, to really come up with creative jobs and with jobs which are needed for the next decades and centuries. So it's a job motor, it's of course a business opportunity, and of course the environment has to be created that also partners, for example, on the African continent, can be part of an international trading system and an international value chain. So it's not about getting green hydrogen, for example, because that's a debate out of the continent for our use, but it is for the use of the continent and for creating markets and combine it with value chains. So it should be for everyone.
All right, no, thank you very much. And I like the point you made initially, which is not one size fits all. So we've heard about the Germany experience, but let's shift it now. Governor Emi Okairi, I mean, we want to also learn from your country's experience. So I pose the same question to you. Give us a sense of really the best practices, you know, in terms of attracting private sector finance into climate and green growth, and give us a sense of really how it's been done in your home country, and what you think we could learn from that.
Thank you. It's done. Of course, I want to say in the beginning that we really, I concur with your remarks, and really the MDBs would need to look at all the options for additional financing. Like was discussed, the financing gap is so huge. Private sector, both domestic and international private sector financing is needed. And in Finland, what we think about of the green transition is really that it's like a key driver of the economy, and there are of course certain risks, and also it needs to be carefully planned. So as an example, I would like to give how we approach these things. So our three ministers, Minister of Finance, Minister of Economy, and Minister of Environment, convened and formed this group of a working group. So it was really inclusive project, 20-something participants, also from the private sector, and they came up with their report, which was published last year. And the issues they identified there, and which I think would be useful for others, is that first of all, this systemic change requires a whole economy approach. And second was that exactly the realization that the private sector is really on a driving seat here. In Finland, it was estimated that 70% of expected investments for this transition would come from private sector. And the public sector role and its involvement would really need to be understood. So the public sector role is specific, and for us it's really the infrastructure investments where the public sector plays role. It's really enabling role, and like colleagues were mentioning, it's giving that political signal on the strategy where we are going to, so that the private sector can adapt. And then of course we also wanted to utilize efficiently the state-owned financial institutions, both national financial institutions and the IFIs, to do this. Another area was circular economy. That was really identified as a key area. And finally, international cooperation. So it's important to have international cooperations and solutions. And here I want to mention the coalition of finance ministers on climate action that was established by Finland in 2019. It's a really useful coalition on sharing experiences and best practices on how to put this in action. Over 80 countries have joined, and I would like to encourage others who might not have already joined to join. It's very useful, and they, for example, just published a month ago a framework guide which is really giving concrete examples on how to do it. I think it has like 140 case studies. So it's there is something for every country in every situation. Like mentioned, the countries are in very different situation, and you would always need to look at these things accordingly. But a few things we see from our point of view important when we think of attracting private climate investment is predictability, policy reforms, good governance, and an enabling environment. Thanks.
No, thank you very much, Governor Okairi. It's interesting. I thought when I hear those words, we're always talking about African countries, which is predictability, policy reforms, enabling environment. And it's very interesting that you spoke about the coalition of finance ministers. So the idea was to even knowledge share amongst various European countries, I mean, globally even. Yeah. Okay. I want to keep this really on the private sector angle. Mm-hmm. So what were some of the biggest, I mean, you said private sector had to deliver 70% essentially of the finances. What were the most important enablers to the private sector in Finland, or the private sector that wanted to work in Finland to deliver on climate and green growth? what were some of the most important enablers that you as government had to deliver, to private sector to attract them to bring that level of funding?
Well, of course, it was first the strategy and the commitment that was mentioned. Finland aims to be carbon neutral by 2035, so that's really an encouragement also for companies, and to seek for new growth opportunities in this area. And then, of course, we needed to use public finance to address and overcome the risks, and really to able to leverage more private sector involvement. And there I also want to mention that we have in our strategy to seek for new markets in the developing countries, and there we are willing to use our development cooperation instruments, blended financing, so really to support with the public financing and lower the risk, because of course the riskier the market, the higher or the more complex or fragile the market, the higher the risk. So here we really understand that the risk aspect needs to be considered.
Okay.
And maybe one more thing I'd like to mention is the importance of data. So this is really what there is a huge opportunity, but there is still a lack of data. It's granular data on ESG and development impact especially. So this is something where I would like to encourage African Development Bank and MDBs to do more. And then we are also in Finland working on this hard to get the statistics right.
Okay, no, thank you very much. So one more example of best practices, especially if it's different. I mean, not one size fit all. Before I go to the financiers, so Governor Bjorg Sankai, good. How's the government of Norway taken advantage of existing sources and innovative instruments to stimulate private climate finance, and how could Africa learn from the experience? So the same question to kick off.
Yes, thank you. I was very inspired by what we heard in the session prior to this one, the launch of the African Economic Outlook, where the chief economist of the African Development Bank said we need to go from megawatts of talk to megawatts of action. And listening to colleagues here on this panel, I think that's exactly what we're doing. In terms of how Norway is involved, we have some experience at home that we're trying to also relate to other contexts. And if we're looking again at what we heard from the presentation of the African Economic Outlook, the potential, the market potential on the African continent for the kinds of investments that we're talking about is huge. And when we try to think about how we can use our public money to unlock the private sector funding that we know is there, and that the private sector actors tell us that they have the money, they tell us that what we can do as public sector is particularly to work around de-risking investments, and that there also actually is a lack of bankable projects in this sector. At home, we have some experience in looking into de-risking. It's also relevant in the Norwegian context, in particular around innovation. So we do have some funding available within Norway, both for de-risking innovation, but also to support innovators in developing their technology or whatever it is, their project that they want to develop. And so we have something similar in our development cooperation, in that we have instruments to try to de-risk. Many people here may be familiar with Norfund, which for a long time has been in the market of de-risking investments in the global south. We've recently also launched a new climate innovation fund, which is managed by Norfund, which specifically de-risks investments in the climate space, which so far has meant renewable energy. So we find that quite interesting. And then to the lack of bankable projects, we also have some funding and expertise available, particularly with NORAD, so our development agency, that can help provide some support for getting those bankable projects to this point where investors can be interested. So that's what we hear when we talk to the private sector, is that we need de-risking, or how you can support us is de-risking, help with the development of bankable projects, and then finally what Finland mentioned as well, the enabling environment, to try to reduce red tape and have the right policies in place, and all those things.
Okay. No, thank you very much. I just want to make sure I heard correctly. The Climate Innovation Fund that you mentioned actually was put together to innovate on de-risking instruments. Is that correct?
Sorry, no, maybe I was unclear. So the Climate Investment Fund, that was launched last year, is linked to Norfund, so the toolbox is quite similar. It's not put in place to fund innovation, but it's put in place to de-risk renewable energy projects. So far, there have been 2 contracts under the Climate Investment Fund, both of them to help replace coal with renewable energy, one in South Africa and one project in India.
I mean, that's actually very interesting, because it also is about charting a decarbonization path, right? And to actually see some of these funds in existence, to encourage that, because as President Adesina says, it's a transition. We're not going to change with one switch of the light bulb. No, but thank you very much. Now, let me jump to the financiers who are a proxy for the institutional investors who can bring the billions to trillions. And Constantine, let me start off with you, and I'll be very direct. You represent a regional multilateral development bank, AIIB. Yeah? So what role should MDBs and DFIs play in general? And I'm going to ask you to criticize me a little bit, and the AFDB in particular, to help African countries crowd in private climate financing. More importantly, how do we scale up MDB's role and interventions?
Thank you very much, Solomon. I will just get straight to this direct question, but allow me just to say a few words, because we are new kids on the block. And I just wanted to introduce us a little bit, because many in the audience just don't know probably Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And we are a multilateral development bank, which is owned by 106 member countries, among them Germany, Finland, and Norway, and Egypt. We are focused, and we see our mandate in financing infrastructure for tomorrow, which is green, which is climate resilient, technology enabled, and primarily private sector financed. Among our shareholders of this 106, there are 13 today member countries from Africa, and we exactly focused on the climate resilient infrastructure, going into and making the first steps here. Today the portfolio is $40 billion. Our first client in Africa was and is Egypt. We did very first deal in Egypt, which was actually private sector deal. And that was the limited recourse project financing. Then we know about this project call, It was one of the first experiences for the bank, and it was 2017 when we joined the program. But today, this limited recourse project financing in the renewables is becoming for us bread and butter. So we are financing and scaling up this experience and trying to work together with the other IFIs and attracting private sector into that space. I wanted to recall one point. In December last year, in Sharm el Sheikh, actually, I attended COP and participated COP27. And one of the key messages which were sent to the multilateral development bank community was that the multilateral development banks should multiply the investment by 3-4 times. And actually, if you look at the infrastructure side of the story, in the emerging markets, IFIs actually finance the single percentage points of the infrastructure. So you multiply it by how many times you will not be able to close this huge gap, which you, Solomon, was talking about. And it's staggering. It's from $30 billion in Africa only a year to 250. That's the challenge. So it is really only possible with the out-of-the-box thinking, innovation, in order to attract this private sector. And this private sector is, fortunately or unfortunately, in the present high interest rate environment, are very much cautious about the risks. And risk adjustment returns in the infrastructure space of the climate infrastructure is not sufficient to attract them. That's the reality. So I think that I heard this very key word for us, for MDBs, the de-risking in the, and I think that it should be key slogan for us.
Okay.
And I think that what we should be centered, what we should be focused on, is really leveraged 1 time, 2 times, 3 times what we are actually investing. It's not generating the grant financing, the blending, then and the distributing. This is the current model. It's not going to work. We need to have the concerted efforts of the IFIs in order to actually stand up to this challenge of bringing this investments. And we're trying to do our best. Today, our indicators are laughable, in fact, because for the private sector investments, we have around, if you look at the operational part of the portfolio, it'll be $9.5 billion. We have $7 billion, 7.5 of mobilized financing, private sector. I'm talking about only private sector.
Sure.
So, and I'm proud of it, but it's such a tremendous task. It's such a difficult task. And we only did what? 9 cents in the dollar, 90 cents in the dollar? And the task is to do it 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, as I said.
Okay.
So let me just finish with one issue, that we are trying to do our best to focus on that leveraging of our investment in the private sector. Of course, we do sovereign as well. And among the instruments for de-risking, I would start with the party risk guarantee in what one of the members, and from Africa, we are exploring this and helping to raise first panda bond. And we will continue with the other member countries with this green bonds in the future. I think that the first loss tranches in the to all of us projects, the limited recourse project financings in the renewable industry is very important. The mainstreaming capital markets instruments, we are very proud that we did the first securitization on the infrastructure. Infrastructure loans in the Asian market. I am confident that together with the African Development Bank, we can bring this to Africa as well. So PPP scale up is a must, and private direct equity investment funds we should continue supporting with which our last investment fund we invested is planning to focus on the North Africa. It's Catalyst Mana fund is planning 5 times leverage over the our anchoring.
Yeah, good.
5 times over, so it's already.
Okay.
Sorry for taking long.
No, it's okay. Constantine, thank you. You're the new kid on the block, so we give you some space.
Can I just say one thing?
Yes, please.
The Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank is going to do their annual meetings here in Sharm el-Sheikh in September, so everybody's invited as well. So.
I knew that he's going to ask me another question, so I wanted to end with this, but thank you for helping me.
So that's interesting. Whoever provides a partial credit guarantee to a panda bond for Egypt will hold their annual general meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh, because it's really the African Development Bank and AIIB who are providing that partial credit guarantee. But new kid on the block. But let me go to somebody who's not a new kid on the block, Dr. Ta. You know, we've heard about the partial credit guarantees for green bonds. We've heard about, you know, the partial risk guarantees to counter government obligations. We've also gone to a higher level. We've, you know, listened to the enablers, the 3 Cs. 2 things. Give me a sense as to whether you feel public-private partnerships, either in the traditional or non-traditional sense, can also really be one of the key instruments that we use for crowding in private sector finance to climate projects. And then, you're not a new kid on the block. What is Badia doing to really, you know, help catalyze private sector financing into climate finance projects and also green growth? Over to you, Dr. Tao.
Thank you very much. I think much has been said about how to attract investment in PPPs in Africa, and I think all the panelists has raised a very valuable point on their experiences in their own countries and how they can, Africa can learn from that. But let me put the things in another perspective. So let us put ourselves in the shoes of the private sector. Instead of talking about how to attract the private sector is looking for investment opportunities, and they want to make money. So we don't need to attract them. They are looking for opportunities. But how to provide them with the right opportunities to invest in Africa? So I think we should put it in this way and put ourselves in the shoes of the investors in general. So 2 things. Investors are looking for consistent return and for risk-free or risk-mitigated return. So basically, and it has been highlighted by all the panelists, we need to de-risk, we need to create an enabling environment, we need to provide predictable return and predictable legal, institutional, and regulatory framework. But more importantly, we need to change the perception about the risk in Africa, because we feel that the risk in Africa is overestimated. And that need a conjunction of action from all the stakeholders. And let me also be a little bit more direct with regard to the role of MDBs. So MDBs are one of the players, but they cannot do everything.
Okay.
So and I don't believe that any single partner or stakeholder can solve all the issues. So it's all about partnership. If we don't work together, none of us can deliver on the mandate to support Africa to attract PPPs financing from the private sector. So my humble opinion is that we need to have all the stakeholders around the same table.
Okay.
Public sector, private sector, bilateral donors, MDBs, philanthropia, civil society, and to work together to come up with a joint action. Each one of us can play a role, which will complement the role of the others. But none of us can alone deliver on this mandate. So our humble opinion is that it is a common action, and we need to work together to deliver on this mandate. So as far as BADEA is concerned, BADEA is a multilateral development finance institution. It's not very new. It has been established in the 70s. It's owned by 18 Arab countries. So we are, and we will have our next board of governors in Sharm el-Sheikh.
Ah, okay. All right. So, Your Excellency, it looks like you're attracting us all in this direction.
This is what we believe in, international partnerships.
Okay, great.
But regarding the climate change, so we have a strategy called BADEA 2030, which is very much aligned with the SDGs. And we are preparing some announcement for the next COP28, and we are working on very innovative solution to support climate finance in Africa. And I would like to call on all the partners here and all other partners that BADEA is ready for partnership, BADEA is open, and we would like to work with all of them to deliver on this mandate. Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Tar, thank you very much. Spoken with wisdom. I'd like to involve our audience. I mean, I cannot see so well with the bright lights, but if anybody in our audience would like to ask a question or make a comment, could you raise your hand and a mic will be brought to you. Program Director, I see 2 hands. I see 3 hands. Does anybody have a mic? I only see 1 mic coming. I see 1 hand there, and then another one at the end, and 1 here.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Vice President Koiner, for this very insightful panel.
Could you speak louder?
Yes.
Okay.
Good afternoon, VP Koiner. Thank you for this insightful panel, the opening remarks. I think they were very inspiring. My name is Alvia Eurlings. I'm representing ILX. We are a Netherlands-based investment manager, and we have been entrusted with 1 billion from Dutch pension funds that would like us to invest alongside the MDBs and the DFIs in their markets. And I just want to add to this discussion that for them, the main de-risking tool is working with MDBs. No blending required when we finance alongside MDBs in their regions, because they feel the extensive experience that the MDBs bring to the table, their track record, their critical deal selection, the way they structure their projects, for them, by the end of the day, gives a decent risk return. We have invested almost 400 million up to date, and we've only been operational for 1 year. So there's a lot we can do. The Dutch pension funds, in this particular case, they stand ready to do more. So the question is, how can we do more? So 2 points here I would like to mention. I think it's been mentioned before, it's the pipeline. We would like to look at a much broader pipeline of projects. There's a lot we can do. There's a lot where the pension funds have an appetite for. So I would really like to call upon the public sector representatives, spend your money there where the pension funds cannot yet be active. So not in solar wind, that is fine for us, but please do support these new markets, these new technologies, because that's beyond our appetite, but we need you to go in first, and then we can come in next. Final point I'd like to make, I had the pleasure to listen to the Africa Economic Outlook. It's a tremendously interesting piece of work. One slide that really has stuck with me was on data on default rates, where the default rates for infrastructure projects were the lowest, really low. And I think we need more of this data, marketing of these data, to counter this perception of risk of working in Africa. For us, it was quite hard to get this data, show it to the pension funds, but we were able to do so also based on our own experience. But if we have more of this data coming out, I think it would be tremendously helpful to get more institutional investors coming to Africa as well. Thank you.
Okay, no, thank you very much, Ms. Earlings. We've actually signed an MOU with ILX. It's another way in which, and I like what she said, there's no blended finance here. Okay, it's mobilization in terms of, depending on our de-risking approach, our presence that gives investors comfort. And I think the other point that Ms. Earlings mentioned, which actually dovetails with what Christopher, that Christopher mentioned, is about MDBs actually respecting the financial additionality and the risk appetite. She's asked the public sector and the MDBs to go where they're not ready to go. And where private sector commercial funders can, leave that space to them. So thank you very much for that point. Yes?
Thank you so much. My name is Roger Kalua. I'm private consulting firm, Kinshasa based in DRC. And I'd like first to commend and thank all the panelists for sharing, mostly Her Excellency Al-Mashad for sharing the Egyptian model, and of course Governor Sancha for presenting what I've understood like kind of requirement for collaborating with Norway or with all the countries that are presented there. And what I would like to say here is not mostly in terms of question, but I would like to commend and to thank Dr. Ta on raising what have been considered from our perspective as a concern. We all know that private sector and public sector still need to collaborate to address climate change issues, and from our perspective we need, from our understanding, private sector need support from public sector in terms of roadmap, in terms of providing a kind of roadmap in reducing climate change issues. And for this, we opening up cross-border negotiations with, we opening up cross-border negotiations with foreign investors to invest in projects in Africa. Thank you, Governor Sancha, for saying that there is a lack of, bankable project. But we have some projects, of course, among projects I've seen in sub-Saharan Africa, mostly in my country, in some other countries around DRC. There are projects, but those projects to be bankable, we still need kind of, help or not help, assistance from technical side, from countries like investors, countries like Norway, like what Dr. Ta has said. And this is an opportunity for me to request if there is a possibility of opening, presenting a model of opening ways of determining what we call in French feasibilities, or driving project to become bankable, because projects are there. We have lack of talent, we have lack of performance, and how can you request for a bankable project if locally we are lacking talent and, performance that can work on that. Thank you so much.
All right. No, thank you very much. I think that was mostly a statement, than a question. I'll be in trouble if I don't invite Dr. Amani Asfor from the Africa Business Council to speak. We have a lot of development partners. We have MDBs. We have a proxy of the institutional investors through ILX, but clearly we don't have the private sector operators here. So, Dr. Amani represents the Africa Business Council, so let me give her the opportunity to reflect the private sector's view.
So thank you very much for all the presenters. So I am Dr. Asfour, President for the Africa Business Council. Actually, the Africa Business Council is established in line of the Heads of State Decision Summit to be the voice of the African private sector. So our membership actually is including all the private sector federations like COMESA Business Council, SADC Business Council, East Africa Chamber of Commerce, West Africa Chambers of Commerce, Pan-African Chamber of Commerce. So actually, and our founding vision is a competitive, borderless, innovative Africa for trade, investment, and industrialization. And our structure, actually, we have 20 clusters. One of them speaks to environment, green economy, blue economy, and climate. So thank you very much for all the presenters who really highlighted what do we need as private sector. Because as my brother Sidiwel Taha had said, really, that the private sector is anxious to invest. But to do that, we really need, I call it the formula of 10 ins. Dr. Mashat had said the 3 C's. We have the 10 ins. The first in actually is the internal policy reforms and regulatory reforms for an enabling environment and business climate. Yesterday, I came from Johannesburg, where I was giving an opening speech for the Pan-African Parliament for policies advocating for the interests of the private sector, because without enabling environment, we cannot go. So now the second in actually is indigenous capacity building for Africa private sector. As my brother has said, we need to build the capacity of the private sector to have skills and knowledge about the green projects, whether in renewable energy, whether in green economy. So we had organized during the COP27 here in Sharm el-Sheikh, a high-level panel with presidential dialogue about the role of private sector investment in renewable energy and green economy. Now, another issue really is about how we have information, as Dr. Taha had said, information for the private sector for the projects in green economy, like the speaker have just said, even if we are attracted, where are the projects, where are the bankable projects? So we need information. That's why within Africa Business Council, we have a database actually from across the continent, how to invest in green economy. Innovation, de-risking. International partnerships, of course, all of you presenters here with international partnership, we as African private sector, we need this partnership, but it's based on actually information needed. We also need integration among ourselves as African private sector. That's why we have now the Africa Business Council. It's 1.5 years old, but we have put our structure to see how we deal with all the financial institutions. Of course, intergenerational dialogue. We need to access actually the startups who are into green economy and technologies. We have to fund them, we have to finance them, and we really need to, as one of the presenters said, to invest in technologies and in green products. So having said that, I think it is very important that public-private sector is based on really how we have this enabling environment, how we have information. So we are currently doing a mapping exercise across the continent of what is needed with green economy. And one of the incentives really is the carbon credit, which is already all of us know, how to make certifications for the companies who are going to be investing in green economy to make it attractive for the private sector to invest in green economy, sustainable agriculture, deforestation, all this. So I am happy as President of Africa Business Council to see how we can partner together and to have public-private sector dialogue. Thank you, my brother Salman, for making it very important for the private sector to engage. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much, Dr. Asfor. Is Minister Amadou Hot here? No. Is there anybody from Africa 50 here?
There was somebody.
There is? From Africa 50?
Yeah, on the right side.
Okay, is that Sapidi? Cynthia, okay, okay, no, thank you. I think we've had a good discussion today, and it's time to bring this to an end. I mean, I would share a few things that I've heard from all of you. And once again, I'm not going to do this in the most structured way, but Your Excellency, you gave us a lead, which is your 3 C's: commitment, clarity, credibility. And country ownership really underpins this. That's one of the things I heard. And you've also agreed to South-South knowledge sharing. I also heard not one size fits all. And partnerships are key, even in the global north, therefore definitely in the global south. I also heard it's an ecosystem approach from Dr. Ta. I mean, you spelled it out, the whole ecosystem that needs to come together. Then I also heard that it can be a business opportunity. The circular economy gave us the example. You know, the global supply chains around green hydrogen gave us another example. And then you also confirmed what Dr. Uroma had said, which is the importance of data, ESG data, development impact data, default data, all of this data that would actually impact investors' decision-making is very important. Then the financiers went directly, de-risking, leveraging, de-risking, leveraging, de-risking, leveraging. Blended finance is not always essential. And then our great conversation starter told us, be smart about using scarce concessional capital. Partnerships is something that one has really heard over and over, and that would really bring us together to be able to deliver this. Let me end by also pitching that we at the African Development Bank believe in partnerships, and we've come up with at least 2 new models with partners, and it's part of the reason I asked if Africa 50 was here. But along with Africa 50, along with the African Union Commission and outer NEPAD, and also with some of the European financial institutions, including Agence Française, EIB, EBRD, and the non-state actors, Rockefeller Foundation, we've come up with what we call the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa. And for the gentleman there, the idea is to actually achieve green-related infrastructure with scale and speed. We need to bring the right skills and also the money at the right time. And so the idea is the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa would raise $500 million amongst ourselves to actually restructure the infrastructure project development market across Africa. Some of it will be done in partnership with Africa 50, some of it will be done always in partnership with local developers, some of it will be done by the global developers who are interested in Africa, like Globalec, etc. Some of it will be done with our own regional developers. But the idea is to actually restructure that infrastructure project development market so that projects, and oh, by the way, the strategic investment funds, like the Egyptian Sovereign Fund, ITHMA Capital, the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority, the Ghana Infrastructure Investment Fund, FONSIS, all of these are our key partners in this delivery. And that's because we need to bring the institutional investors in as quickly as possible so we as MDBs, DFIs can recycle our capital and once again generate more opportunities. There's also something we call infrastructure asset recycling. We're doing this with Africa 50, but we're welcoming other partners. It's to actually take existing state-owned infrastructure that's functioning and essentially concession it out, give public sector capital that it can pledge towards developing green infrastructure that it would finance either as PPPs or fully as, in some cases, public, and then recycle again, and so get that capital back. So all of a sudden, we create a revolving system for governments to finance their infrastructure development in the long term. I'm just giving two examples, Christopher, of where we're trying to buck the trend, okay, where we're trying to address the gaps, Ms. Erlings, where institutional capital would not address. And once again, we're doing this in partnership. But country ownership is the starting point. Partnerships come to complement. So let me end by saying thank you very much to my distinguished guests, panelists, and also to our great conversation starter. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can we take a picture together?